Thought I would read the daily text today, Tuesday, January 14, 2020. Your leader is one, the Christ. Matthew 23:10. When we do not fully understand the reasons for organizational changes, we do well to reflect on how Christ exercised his leadership in the past. Whether in Joshua's day or in the first century, Christ has always provided wise direction to protect God's people as a whole, to strengthen their faith, and to maintain unity among God's servants. Jesus' loving concern for our spiritual welfare is clearly reflected in the timely direction given by the faithful and discreet slave. When we discern Christ's direction, we sense his keen interest in our spiritual advancement. In addition to caring for our spiritual needs, Christ helps us to keep our focus on the most important work being done on earth today, our preaching activity. Well, friends, I believe wholeheartedly that Christ is the head of the congregation. He was in the first century. He has a congregation that will be in existence when he returns. And I believe he's been using the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society to accomplish this all-important work, as they say. But this comment that they opened up with, when we do not fully understand the reasons for some organizational changes, we do well to reflect on how Christ leads us. Well, good advice generically, but what they're saying is everything this organization does is with Jehovah's approval, has his blessing. It has to be. Christ is head of the congregation. He's running everything. It's not us. Now think about that. It is well known now that the Watchtower has paid up huge sums of money to child abuse victims in what is called out-of-court settlements. They know they'd lose more if they went to court, so they cut their losses. We should know how Jesus feels about children. They're dear to him and Jehovah. In fact, he rebuked his apostles in the first century because they tried to prevent the children from coming to Jesus so he could bless them. So how does Jesus feel about an organization that takes no responsibility for shuffling pedophiles around here and there, making it impossible for the law enforcement agencies to be involved, won't allow its elders to cooperate with law enforcement agencies investigating a crime committed against a child, and then they pay off the child? On one hand, the Watchtower says of abuse victims, it's good if you can find a confidant and talk about your problems. It's cathartic. It will help you heal. And then the Watchtower's lawyers give a victim a sum of money. Here, kid, take the money, and don't say a word. They're bound with a legal gag order that prevents them from following the advice the Watchtower gives about talking about their terrible experience. Are you disturbed by these organizational doings? You shouldn't be. It's Jesus. Jesus is responsible for all of that. Do you believe that? More recently, the Watchtower has, I shouldn't say more recently, the payoffs are, I'm sure, ongoing and will be in the future, but The Watchtower more recently has begun selling off kingdom halls, and not just a few. You would think that, buildings go through a natural lifespan. They become sometimes so badly in need of repairs that it's better just to tear them down or sell them and move on. I get that. Some kingdom halls are in decrepit ghettos and it's no longer even safe to meet there. But that's not what they're selling. They are selling dozens and dozens of the most beautiful kingdom halls, beautiful buildings in safe neighborhoods in suburbia. You may or may not know this, but every kingdom hall is owned by the Watchtower. It doesn't matter that the local brothers built it, paid for it, the Watchtower owns it. And so I'm sure some of these organizational changes they're talking about is when the Watchtower comes in and says, hey, everybody out. You're going over to this congregation. You're driving 30 miles over there. We don't care where you're going. Just get out of here. We're selling this place. It's ours. That's all Jesus doing that. Never mind that every kingdom hall was solemnly dedicated to Jehovah. And the brothers and sisters who built these facilities happily did so because they were doing it for Jehovah, not for the Watchtower. Not for the Watchtower to flip kingdom halls like a real estate transaction. They wanted a place in their community where they could bring people to hear about the truth. So here's a building that's been dedicated to God, and then it's sold like ordinary real estate. And they don't care who buys it. They're turned into, some kingdom hall got turned into a mosque. Yeah, they don't care. One kingdom hall was turned into a little shop and go liquor store. You give this building to Jehovah. I mean, I dedicated myself to Jehovah in baptism. Can I just I didn't mean that. I don't think so. Not without consequences. The scripture says, what you vow, pay. Why should the true God have to wreck the work of your hands? The Watchtower doesn't recognize anything as sacred. They're businessmen now. Lawyers are running the organization. And by the way, the governing body makes this pretense that they're calling the shots. They're making the decisions. They're not. Long ago, back in the early 90s, the governing body signed over the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society to a faceless, nameless board of directors. They run all the business affairs of the organization, the legal stuff and all that. The governing body just does the teaching. They're the face of the Watchtower, but they don't control the Watchtower. So who does? Well, we'll find out someday maybe, but obviously the Masons have infiltrated the Watchtower, as they have virtually every other influential institution. I won't get into that, but this business of Jesus being the head of his congregation, and so whatever this organization does has his approval, that is a blind for this kind of wickedness. I'd like to share a little passage with you written by the foremost Christian, I believe, the Apostle Paul. No one was more zealous for the truth than Paul. And he started the Corinthian congregation. They were like his children. And he didn't stop caring about them, but he moved on to keep planting seeds. But starting off in the 11th chapter of 2 Corinthians, he says, "For I am jealous over you with a godly jealousy. For I personally promised you in marriage to one husband, that I might present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I am afraid that somehow, as the serpent seduced Eve by his cunning, your minds might be corrupted away from the sincerity and chastity that are due to Christ." Well, what was the spiritual danger that they were exposed to? Well, Paul exposed it. There were certain men who were very influential in the Corinthian congregation, and they disrespected Paul, the founder of the congregation. And they said, oh yeah, his letters are weighty, but his presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. They were good speakers, evidently. They were Greek orators in the tradition. So Paul unloaded on them, didn't he? In verse 12, he says, "But what I am doing, I will continue to do in order to eliminate the pretext of those who are wanting a basis for being found equal to us in the things about which they boast." They wanted to be leaders. They wanted to be apostles. "For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself keeps disguising himself as an angel of light. It is therefore nothing extraordinary if his ministers also keep disguising themselves as ministers of righteousness. But their end will be according to their works." Paul was saying it's no big deal that these men can present themselves as being in the truth. Ministers of righteousness. They weren't on the outside. You know, the Watchtower says that these superfine apostles represent the clergy. Well, that's another blind. Just like they're saying the man of lawlessness is the clergy. The apostasy that's coming, that happened 1,000 years ago. Whatever. This organization is practicing true worship. It's a spiritual paradise. So, Paul showed that even though Christ was the head of the congregation, there were wicked men whom Satan maneuvered and empowered into positions of influence. Oh, what's it say of the man of influence? He exerts a deluding, the man of lawlessness. He exerts a deluding influence. That wouldn't be outside the Christian congregation. It would influence those who were believers, who belonged to Christ. That's why Paul was worried that somehow they would be corrupted by this wicked influence that Christ allowed to remain in his congregation. You know, if you read in Revelation, the letters that Jesus sent to the 7 congregations, he allowed all manner of things to go on in his congregation. And of course, the Watchtower says, yeah, that's the clergy. But it's not. John warned the brothers not to be misled by this Jezebel or Balaam influence within the congregation. So the Watchtower's reasoning here that if you question or don't understand some organizational changes, it's your fault, because this is Jesus doing all this. And that is a lie. It's not the way it was in the first century. They say, look at the first century. Well, Jesus allowed quite a bit of wrongdoing to go on. It exists as a test for the faithful, right? But the day is coming, as Paul said. They'll be judged according to their works. Now, the Watchtower always refers to the faithful and discreet slave. But Jesus presented it as a question. Who really is this faithful and discreet slave? Happy is that slave if, two little letters there, if his master, on arriving, finds him doing his job. And then Jesus said, but if that slave says in his heart, my master is delaying, and he beats his fellow slaves and hangs out with the confirmed drunkards, and then the master comes at an hour he does not expect and punishes him with the greatest severity. So who really is the faithful and discreet slave? That's yet to be determined. And it will not be manifest until the Master comes, the second coming of Jesus Christ. So, and bad news for you. Some slaves will not be found faithful. They'll be put out and assigned their portion with the hypocrites. So, there's a lot in these daily texts, isn't there? Yeah. I guess that's about it. Talk to you tomorrow.